So I'm Sarah David. I'm a coach and management consultant, and I'm a Queen Bee coaching volunteer. I sit on the steering group. I'm a volunteer coach, and I work with a group of us who are developing Queen Bee coaching's profile in Greater Manchester. Those of you who've been on the call before will hopefully know us by now, which is super exciting. So Queen Bee coaching is, what we're doing is providing free coaching to women in leadership in Greater Manchester who wouldn't otherwise be able to access coaching. So we're looking to lift up, amplify and accelerate those brilliant women out there already doing great things in community roles, private roles, volunteering roles, public sector roles, political roles. It doesn't matter where. If you know a brilliant woman doing these great things who you think, you know what, 6 months of coaching with a coach to really accelerate and amplify your impact on the world, what you will see in the chat box coming up, amongst many other things, is a link. Tap that woman on the shoulder, really encourage and invite her to apply to get a Queen Bee coach. We have coaches waiting. We're in that situation. We've got nearly 60 coaches now, and we're waiting for more brilliant women to come forward. In everything we do, we're looking to reflect the demographics, the diversity, and most importantly, the dynamism of Greater Manchester. So really encourage you all to tap those women on the shoulder, or are you one of those women? Apply. If you're a coach and haven't yet signed up, please do sign up to be a coach as well. You get one client at a time that works for you. So it's not at all overwhelming. It's brilliant and beautiful. We are part of the Pankhurst Trust. And as many of you will know, there's two aspects to the Pankhurst Trust. The first is the Heritage Centre. The Pankhurst Heritage Centre is where the suffragette movement started, preserving, that's the word, and they are preserving that site, so you can still go and stand in that room where the suffragette movement started on 63 Nelson Street opposite the hospital. The second part of what the Trust does is obviously Manchester Women's Aid, and you're going to see a link in a minute to be able to give. We're asking if everybody on this call could give £5 to the Pankhurst Trust. Right now, there's obviously a significant increase in domestic violence, and then the impact is that obviously we need to be providing PPE to all those people who are actually in refuge, and that's a cost that obviously the Pankhurst wasn't expecting to cover in February this year. So if you could open that link now and then come back to it after the call so that you can save it and come back to it, that would be great. We'd like to particularly thank CMS, the law firm, and Music Magpie. With them and other donations, we've raised over £1,000 so far for the Pankhurst during this period, and we'd love to get it to £1,500, so any little bit would help. In the chat box, please throw in any questions you've got for Helen. So put a big Q in front of it so we can follow it, and then any questions that you've got for Helen about her book, Difficult Women. So throw them in the chat box. And if you're a social media type, we're on all the platforms now. We've got this amazing volunteer team of mainly younger women, it's fair to say, who are awesome and developing our whole social media. So you can find us on any platform at QBC Pankhurst. So please, again, particularly, you know, if you haven't got any cash to be able to give, just, you know, that's another way to support us, is to get the message out there. And our hashtag today is Queen Bee Radical Talks. So now what I would like to do is to introduce you to the serial entrepreneur, international trade specialist, green tech innovator, international leadership coach and business mentor, Dr Marilyn Comrie. She's the director of the Blair Project, and she's also the founder of the Black United Representation Network, Burn CIC. For anyone who's interested or touched by all of the Black Lives Matter movement, check out Burn CIC in Greater Manchester. I have only ever found Marilyn to be utterly delightful, but I do know that she's definitely a radical thinker, and she assures me that she has been called difficult on more than one occasion. So I am now going to hand over to her, and she's going to take us through this interview. Marilyn, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sarah, and hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to host this interview with you today. I think we're going to have a great time. Our guest today is Helen Lewis. She's a staff writer at The Atlantic and a former deputy editor at The New Statesman. We'll be discussing Helen's first book, Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. It tells the imperfect and unfinished story of the battle for women's rights, exploring the lives of some of the complicated and contradictory women involved. I personally wear the badge of difficult woman with pride, but I know it's not an easy one. So the title of this series is Radical Thinking for Radical Times. And the women in your book, Helen, can certainly be described as radical. But what I wanted to start off with is for you to describe what is a difficult woman. How would you describe her?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because, as you say, you don't want to give the idea that actually you kind of are being sort of stroppy and needlessly rude to people, or being a diva, or any of that kind of associations that we have. And what I'm talking about really is the idea that you have to have principles. You know, you have to have things that you will not compromise on. You know, you have to sometimes put your point of view out there in ways which seem quite uncompromising to other people. You have to insist on things. You know, you have to not be all the things that women are taught to be, you know, selfless, put yourself last, you know, always there making the cups of tea and wiping the bottoms and doing all the things that keep the world running. Sometimes you have to be the one who is, you know, making the change. So that's the difficult bit of Difficult Woman, is about the fact that you just have to be prepared to stand up for what you believe in.
And why do you think being difficult is such a radical act, or is seen to be?
Well, I think for the reasons that I've talked about, I think, you know, the world runs on the unpaid labour of women. And one of the ways that you know, that process continues is by saying, oh, but women are just much better at it. You know, they're just kinder, they're better at multitasking. You know, they're much more naturally suited to all of that. And I'm not sure I entirely buy that. I think most people have a personality, and actually they don't conform to a stereotype in one direction or another. There are some men who absolutely love being stay-at-home dads. There are some women who think that staying at home with their kids would be the thing that would just make them want to, you know, not carry on with it anymore. So you have to just adapt to the world to people's personal circumstances. But the thing that I do feel very strongly, you know, and I think it's one of the nicer things about getting older, I don't know if you feel this, is that you put up with a lot less, right? I think stuff that I would have put up with in my 20s, I'm now think, why am I doing this? Why am I being asked to do this? You know, being asked to act as a secretary to a colleague who's on the kind of same level as you. One of the ones that gets to me actually is when you do a big panel at like a say Conservative or Labour Party conference, at a political conference, being asked to be the chair of it, and then a load of men being the speakers. So they're there to air their big important thoughts, but you're there like mummy to kind of bring out all the best in them. And I think that relegation of women to those secondary roles, like being everybody's sort of support human, is one of the things that I really wanted to write about, because I think it's a big problem when we're asking for our rights. You know, it's always, you know, either people be dead against, or more likely now what happens is, yeah, we can see how that's important, but this comes first. Sorry, we'll get to you, but this comes first.
And how do you think, what's your view on how have other women responded or reacted to these difficult women? And I'm saying that really because I remember once I was on a flight on an international trade mission, and I met, I was having a chat with a female coach who said to me, Marilyn, you're one of those women who make men feel inadequate, which really, really surprised me. And up until then, I'd always seen it as sisters supporting sisters. So it was very interesting, her reaction.
I think that's really telling, because I mean, I write this in the book, you know, I don't think that sexism is purely something that is done by men to women. I think that we live in a sexist society. So it's about structures. And actually, there's lots of times as a woman when it is better to screw over other women to get yourself ahead, right? And I think that's a really important dynamic. I talk in the book about Cather Pollitt, the American feminist, has coined this thing called Smurfette syndrome. So the idea is that the Smurfs, the little blue adorable creatures, there was only Smurfette, there was only one female Smurf. And so a similar thing I think happens in powerful companies, for example, or in politics, is the idea if there can only be one female Smurf, then the only way I'm going to get to be the female Smurf is by knocking off the perch of the person who's currently female Smurf. And I think you do get that, I saw it very clearly when Meghan Markle joined the royal family, and it instantly became a contest between her and Kate Middleton. And you think, well, why? Hang on a minute. Why are these two people being set up in opposition to each other? That seems very strange. Or the fact that, Theresa May was obviously compared enormously to Margaret Thatcher, and it was Iron Lady 2.0. And actually, she was much, much more like Gordon Brown. That was the obvious reference point for her premiership in lots of different ways, both in terms of her work ethic, but also in terms of her bad strategic decision-making about elections, all of that, her inability to communicate with people. But people just saw the fact that she was a woman and they said, oh, okay, there's been one of them before. I remember this most distinctly, it was Margaret Thatcher. And it blinded them to her actual personality. And I think that's what was probably going on in the situation with you, perhaps, was the feeling of, wow, I wish I could be that forceful and that strong, but actually isn't that a bit challenging? Wouldn't I be better to sort of say, you're too forceful and challenging, I'm on the side of the guys, we're all the guys, and I'm an honorary one of the guys in this situation.
And do you think in many cases, what is described as a difficult woman is actually somebody who's assertive? And if it was a man, it would be seen as leadership qualities.
There's some very good research on this, actually, in Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, which is a book that there are some other problems around. She's quite blind to the sort of economic challenges that lots of other women face, which she wrote about in Plan B, her next book after her husband died quite suddenly. But she does write about this really interesting thing about the correlation between likability and success. So we tend to like successful men more. We find them more likable. We tend to like successful women less. Sorry, I get that wrong. Right. Yeah. So successful men are more likable. Successful women are less likable. And I think that's really true if you've ever been in an office, because there's something about female success that kind of puts people on edge. People wonder if it's been earned, or, they don't necessarily see women in leadership roles. I talk to quite a lot of school teachers, which is really interesting to me because that's a female dominated workforce, but actually still the senior leadership levels are very male dominated. Headmasters are far more common than headmistresses across the sector. And that's not just purely about male teachers. That's a female workforce actually being more comfortable with men in positions of power. And structural stuff like women leaving the workforce in their 20s and 30s to have children, meaning that they get, they drop down a track. They don't go onto the senior management track. But that's what I mean about the idea that it's something that we're all just much more used to male power. That's the kind of default. That's the unquestioned one. And I write about politics all the time, so I think about this quite a lot. There is nothing has helped men in politics more, I'm convinced of this, than the existence of the navy suit. Because you get up, you put on your navy suit, and that's it. You've worn, it's not invisible, that's a horrible thought when it comes to Boris Johnson or whoever, but it's the clothing that makes absolutely no statement about your personality. You're not taking a side, it's completely neutral. And there is nothing for women that does similarly, right? You can't get up in the morning and just put on something that no one will ever comment on. And I think that's really powerful. It's, the great thing that Ginger Rogers said about doing everything that Fred Astaire did, but backwards in high heels. And I think that really does apply to women when they achieve success. You have to do everything that the man did, but backwards in high heels, with that extra level of demand on you because you're a woman.
Mm. So for the benefit of those of us who haven't yet had a chance to read your book, can you describe some of the women for us?
Yeah, I'd love to. So as I say, I picked the idea of writing about it in fights because I thought, what's the most interesting thing to me? I started writing it in late 2017, where I felt pretty bruised by politics, actually. I thought the referendum campaign was quite a nasty thing to cover. There was a lot of anger and vitriol involved in that. Ditto, Donald Trump's, the way that he won the presidency was quite unpleasant to watch. And I thought, I'm personally on the political left, that actually has, you know, had we as liberals, had we as social progressives who wanted more rights for minorities, had we kind of run out of steam? You know, had feminism sort of stalled to some extent? And then I thought, well, I'll go back and look at what, you know, what makes change happen? How did, you know, if we look at these victories like the vote, like the right to divorce, like the right to equal pay, let's find out how they did it. You know, what lessons for campaigning can we learn? So I start off writing about divorce and Caroline Norton in a child custody campaign in the Victorian era. And I wrote about that because I got divorced when I was, I want to say how old I am, I always forget how old I am, but let's say I was a lot younger than I am now. I was sort of 28 or so. And I was very lucky because we didn't have kids, we didn't have a massive amount of assets to split up. But, you know, at the time, you had to either be separated for 2 years or 5 years if the other person contested it, or go for divorce on the basis of fault. And that put a lot of pressure on women. It's really hard if you're in an abusive relationship, for example, which I wasn't, but if you are, you know, to go into that court and say what the other person has done is likely just to make them angrier and more controlling. And so I was incredibly relieved that just the week before last, we finally got no fault divorce. So that procedure now will be much simpler. It involves simply two people saying we don't want to be married anymore, and the state is not going to ask them to go into the reasons why. And that to me is going to be a huge, huge boon for women, because it is going to take a lot of the divisiveness and the polarity of those arguments out. And actually, hopefully, you can have more sensible adult conversations about, you know, particularly if you've still got kids, we still have to have a relationship. It's not going to be the same relationship we had before. How do we do that in the most cooperative, consensual way? And so those are the kind of things that I thought big legislative changes are really interesting, because they're what underpin equal rights. It seems brilliant to have, you know, a hashtag campaign on Twitter or to raise people's consciousness, but you need to do that in the service of moving to the second thing. So I wrote about the vote, obviously completely massive, and, you know, a still a live issue now. The idea of kind of compulsory voter registration, for example, in Britain is a really bad one. There is almost no voting fraud, and it will really affect the franchise. For example, students, low-income groups, ethnic minority groups. You know, it will skew the demographics of who votes even more. So that seems like an incredibly historical issue, but is still an issue for today. I wrote about access to women's sport, and that's come up again during the pandemic. You know, it's very hard. Amma Bweze, who I talked to, who was the captain of the England netball team, you know, she was earning about £30,000 a year as the captain of, you know, a Commonwealth Games winning sports side. And she was living in a shared flat, you know, or sometimes back at her parents' house. There was just no money in women's sport. And the rationale that's always given is because no one wants to watch it. Well, as soon as you put the Women's World Cup on BBC One last year, it turned out people really did want to watch it. People, it turns out, will basically watch any football. I don't understand it, but they love it. There we go. And actually, you know, we just need to give women's sport much more of a chance in terms of viewership. But there is still this feeling that, you know, sports for men, sports what men watch and what men do. So yeah, it's an eclectic book to take you from divorce to sport, to sex, to the first lesbian MP in the 1970s, and then all the way up to the present. And this is the bit that I think people have really cottoned onto because of the pandemic. One of the chapters is called Time, and it's about exactly that problem that I think a lot of women have faced when they've been homeschooling or trying to cope with, you know, having kids at home during the pandemic. And, you know, more women are in part-time work. In straight couples, women are much more likely to be the lower earner. And so they have ended up soaking up a lot of childcare, particularly if they haven't been able to rely on their families when lockdown was really severe. And that's put them back a huge one. We saw fewer research papers from female researchers, for example, in the last couple of months. Lots of women's careers have taken a really big hit, and their ability to, you know, their lifetime earnings will probably have taken a big hit. And that again is about the idea that childcare is still seen as this, you know, it's fundamentally your problem. It's not really the state's problem, it's your problem.
That's right. And so why did you think it was important to tell the stories of these difficult women?
Well, there are a couple of different reasons, and one of which is, I don't know if you're not on Twitter, are you? You're very sensibly, you are on Twitter?
Yes.
Oh, well, you'll know this in that case. You know, sometimes people can be a little bit, you know, non-understanding about the fact that everybody's kind of human and nobody's perfect. shall we say, put it like that. And I thought it's a really useful corrective to say we have to live with the fact that, for example, Mary Stopes, who did huge amounts of work to get women in charge of their own fertility, contraceptive, was also a eugenicist. She was anti-Semitic. She was a terrible snob. Or perhaps, Erin Pizzey, who founded the first women's refuge in 1971 in Chiswick in West London. She's now a men's rights activist, who says feminism has destroyed the nuclear family. And we have to, these controversies keep coming up, and we need to decide how we deal with them. Otherwise, we can't really move forward. What is our relationship to history? I think we've seen that very strongly in the debate over statues. Do we, history is a process. It's something that we keep. We don't have, those statues don't have to be up forever. Just because someone had a statue to them in 1835 doesn't mean that's it, they've got it in perpetuity. We get to decide now what we want to remember and what things we want to honor and how we want to talk about history. And I thought that was the primary impulse about doing that, to try and restore some of the complexity to those fights.
So, as well as difficult women, the book deals with some difficult issues. How did you decide what topics that you were going to cover and focus on?
Yeah, well, I went through an interesting process. It started off as 8 fights, a history of feminism in 8 fights, and then I kept finding more and more fights that I just found were really interesting. And that time chapter got added quite late on, because I had a chapter about leisure and women's leisure, and it ended up being split up into 2, into the sport chapter and the time chapter, because I felt like the fight that underlies all the other fights is having less time than men. We know from all the statistics, women have less leisure time. They do more unpaid work than men do. So that fight was very easy to come to when I finally kind of split that off. But some of them were much harder to work out. So I knew I wanted to write, for example, about the history of lesbianism, because I think it's fascinating to me that that's been forgotten so much. People think the first gay MP was Chris Smith of New Labour. And it wasn't. It was Maureen Colquhoun a decade and a half earlier. She very, very bravely came out in 1976, when that was just, this sort of amazingly crazy thing for a person to have done in everyone else's eyes. And I wanted to put her back into history. And one of the things that's been lovely about that is Kezia Dugdale, who was Labour's Scottish leader, who's also lesbian, wrote to me and said, I cried when I read this chapter. I didn't know there was another, that when she came out in 2016, I didn't know that this had already happened 40 years earlier. Can I write to Maureen? And they're now pen pals. They've been writing to each other. And I think that's exactly what I'm talking about, that connection of the past and the present, and the struggles of then and the struggles of now. I'm sure they've got some things in common, and some things have changed utterly in that time. So those are the things I looked for. I looked for substantive legal reforms, or policy changes or attitude changes that you could point to, and interesting people who were behind them. And one of the other things I wanted to do as well was not pick everybody have made a success. So Jayaben Desai, who I talk about, who was the leader of the strike in the 1970s at Grunwick, the film processing laboratory. She worked in Northwest London in this film processing lab that was primarily filled with women and recent migrants. She was Gujarati, she moved to Tanzania and then to Britain. And because of that workforce, the managers felt they could keep them on very low pay and exploit them. And she led this strike at a time when the trade union movement was very white, very male. And she didn't win, she didn't win that battle, but she did something very important in how she changed how we thought about industrial labor and relations and who the working class are, right? And now when I read the stories about Leicester and the fact that coronavirus spikes have been happening because of these garment factories, which is again a primarily migrant workforce, lots of women, terrible conditions and badly paid, is exactly the situation again. And where are the trade unions there? Where is the journalism that's covering that? Well, we're getting to it, but we're getting to it quite late. But actually, this not where is the Jayaben Desai of today? Could that militancy happen again today? I think probably not. The relationship between managers and workers has just changed, and not really for the better, actually. So that's why I picked the fights that I did.
Right. To what extent do you think that the current pandemic presents an opportunity to reset society, if you like, and build back fairer? And to what extent do you think, in terms of, because it's we're in a period of massive change. To what extent do you think it's really, really important that in order to drive change, you have to be a difficult woman, or can you drive change and not be a difficult woman?
I mean, I think the big way that the big split that's really useful to look at, I think, is the difference between the suffragists and the suffragettes. So the militant suffragettes who, you know, bombed places, they threw hatchets at the Prime Minister, they burnt golf greens, they slashed paintings, they, you know, all of that stuff, versus militant forces suffragists who held massive marches, who lobbied Parliament, you know, who did all that work. And it's presented as a sort of catfight, like, you know, which one of them won, which one of them was the right way to do it. And the real answer to me is that you needed both of them. And actually they both, you end up in a situation where they have the Speakers' Conference in 1916 about giving women the vote. And both Millicent Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst are both there. And they both sign on to the compromise about only women over 30 and property owners getting the vote, because they say, you know, once we've established this bulwark, once we've made up the principle, then we can fight for universal suffrage, which they then got 10 years later. And I thought it was really interesting, you know, this is two organisations that had huge ideological and structural differences, but what they both had a sense of all the way through is, what do we want? Like, what's the thing we're asking for, and who can give it to us, and how do we get it? And so, yeah, despite, you know, huge fallings out about the Pankhurst being quite autocratic and whether or not militancy was a good strategy, they were able still, you know, to come together and be in the same room together, which I think is a useful thing to remember. But yeah, I agree with you. I think this is an incredibly interesting time. The government is basically picking what bits of the economy to save. And that's the point where women need to really make their voices heard, because, for example, the earlier sector is in a really bad state. You know, nursery provision has been really badly hit. And, you know, we're having this issue with schools going back and how much, you know, how quickly do you open them? And I wrote a piece for The Atlantic, which said basically, you know, you have to pick what to open first. You should pick schools. Because if, you know, we have this summer holiday effect where kids from low-income families fall behind, that will be magnified hugely by keeping schools closed for 6 months or patchily open. You know, if you have to keep pubs shut, I'm sorry, but like, schools first, then pubs. And I think that's why it needs to be massive pressure on the Chancellor to say which, you know, what are our priorities as a country?
Yeah, exactly. Now, one phrase in the book really sums up everything in terms of what it means to be a difficult woman, is this particular phrase, which is, being difficult gives you leverage, but it also is exhausting. So bearing in mind the effort being difficult takes, how can we support women in their difficulty?
I think that's a really good question, because I agree with you, and I don't know if you felt this in your career, that sometimes you just think, you know, I'd love the easy life. Like, wouldn't it be nice just to go with the flow and just like give up and stop fighting anymore? But, you know, but you have to do it for the, you know, for the women who come after you. And every generation we get a little bit further. So my big takeaway from the book is, keep your eyes focused on the prize. What is it that you actually want? You know, only be difficult in the service of getting stuff done, and decide, you know, what it is that you want. And this is why I think policies and laws are the best way to look at this, because then you can work backwards to build the coalition that you need. And I don't know if this has been the case in your career, that you've done that. You've kind of gone, here's what I want, you know, who's with me? And that's kind of easier than feminism being a kind of club, or feeling that it's a, you know, a group of like-minded women or whatever. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't need to be. It needs to have some common principles. But it, you know, there's a great Andrea Dworkin quote that I put in the book about, you know, feminism is for all the women that you disagree with, all the women that you used to like and can't stand to be around anymore, because it's about what you can get done. You know, it's not a therapy session or a kind of, you know, Women's Institute meeting, lovely as I'm sure Women's Institute meetings are, I must say, but like, it's a political project. And that's the thing to remember above everything else.
Absolutely, because I think it's the things that I tend to avoid are talking shops, but the things I get involved in, because my time is so precious, is action. It's the deeds, not words. Yeah. And I absolutely agree with you on the keeping your eye on the prize, because the other thing is if you've got your eye on the prize, you know you're going to fall down, you pick yourself back up again. But I think throughout all of that, you really do need the support of people who've got your back, who share the same vision and goals as you go along, and you will get there. But it's understanding that it's not a linear process. Sometimes you have to go over, under, through, around, right. But you're very, very focused on achieving that goal. So you say that truly radical feminism does not suggest women's behaviour is the problem, but instead makes demands on power. Could you explain a bit more about what you mean by this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of patrolling about how women could do things differently. So one of the classic examples that I talk about, Deborah Cameron, the linguistics researcher at Oxford, wrote a really interesting blog post about this idea that women say sorry too much. And this is one of the reasons they don't get ahead in business. And she said, well, hang on a minute, what is too much? Anyway, we could equally well phrase that as women, like men don't say sorry enough. But what we proceed from this model, it's kind of deficit model of women's behavior, where because men have got all the power, whatever they're doing must be right. And if women aren't doing that, then women are doing something wrong, and it's their job to fix it and get better. And I found really interesting research when I was looking at this about asking for pay rises, because they always say, well, the trouble with women is they don't ask for pay rises. Well, actually, it looks like women really do ask for pay rises, but they just don't get them. And I think that's the thing that's interesting to me, is about the way that, you know, because it's so much less challenging to people who've got power to try and make women change their behavior, lots of stuff gets channeled towards that, rather than asking, what do you, people in power, what are you going to do? What are you going to change? What are you going to give up fundamentally? I just think about, women being sort of how they juggle childcare or something like that. Well, can we not go back to the fundamental principle and ask why should they have to? Why shouldn't we have what the second wave has demanded, which was free universal childcare? What are our priorities as a country? What do we think is really important? And I think that's the problem, is that, and I think you will always find, as a journalist, I know if I want to get an article commissioned, slagging off another feminist, get it commissioned in a heartbeat. There's and a huge audience for it as well. And nitpicking at what other women are doing wrong or how they could change their behaviour just becomes a sort of diversion tactic from saying, what do we do together? What do you have to do differently, person who's got money or power?
Yeah, and that very much marries with a report that I read recently about white supremacy in organisations. And what it was really talking about is that we've normalised that kind of white male way of running an organisation, where they're allowed to hoard power, where there is the blame culture. And actually what we really need to do is to challenge that culture that has become the norm, because what it's doing is holding us back as a society, and actually it is the root cause of most forms of discrimination. So we need to shift away from that blame culture, where power is consolidated with a very few people, and move towards a learning organisation where it's okay to make a mistake, because after all, we are all humans.
I think that's really important. I've just written a piece for The Atlantic, which hopefully will go up at the end of this week, that's exactly about one of my issues about the way that diversity training is used as displacement activity. Now, I think being aware of your own biases is brilliant and wonderful, and something that we should all try and bear in mind. We do all carry around with us unconscious assumptions about what power looks like, about what authority looks like, in ways that are, really detrimental to women and ethnic minorities. But equally well, I do think that they can often be used as a kind of, well, tick, we've done that. And, we don't look at the structural things that are holding back women and ethnic minorities, like what is your entry level salary? Can someone live on this wage? When we talk about journalism or publishing or the creative industries, about how white they are, well, one of the reasons for that is that anybody from a middle class or below family can't, who doesn't have big amounts of money from their mum and dad, can't go through unpaid internships for years, or live in London in their parents' spare room for years until they get to a stage where they can actually make decent money. And you can have all the talking shops, as you said, that you want, but until people can, afford to pay their rent and work in an industry, you're not going to get a full diversity of people working in it.
That's right. And so what I'm going to do is move now to the audience questions. And we have one from Shana Lennon, which is, what can be done about society's narrow perception of the attributes of leaders? Hard-faced, empathetic. Is there such a thing as feminist leadership?
I mean, I think there is, because I think feminist policy making is definitely something that exists. So my friend Caroline Criado Perez wrote a brilliant book called Invisible Women, which talks about the gender data gap. And, you know, that's something that's been massively, nothing has brought home her point better than COVID-19. Because actually we found out quite early on that men were dying in higher rates of it. We knew that men were more likely to get sent to intensive care. I think that might very well be to do something that women's immune systems might protect them. But there's been very little research into the female immune system because it's kind of weird and different and not the default human. Ditto, having that level of data was also what allowed us to see that particularly BME people, particularly people from South Asian communities, were dying at much, much higher rates than white people. And we would just simply wouldn't have known about that extra risk, and hopefully therefore be able to mitigate that extra risk if, you know, we hadn't got that proper level of data and research. And so I think you can definitely have inclusive policy making. In terms of leadership, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic quite early on saying, you know, there was this meme going around that Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand had done quite well, Angela Merkel had done quite well, you know, Nicola Sturgeon had done quite well. So maybe women are really just good at leadership. And actually the research on that and caution is not, you know, risk-taking is not particularly robust. What is very obvious is that that very macho style of leadership, that what I call strongman leadership, you know, that authoritarian leadership. So, you know, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, that's really bad, because that's a model of leadership that's predicated on like shouting and intimidating your enemies, you know, shouting and intimidating the press. And you can't, none of that works on a virus. Like it just, they don't respond to bullying and intimidation. You know, they keep on going on infecting people's respiratory tracts, you know, with gay abandon. And so there are lots of male leaders as well who are doing really well, who locked down. But what the problem wasn't men or women, it was a particular style of male leadership that we had seen in a couple of different countries. And I think, you know, ever since that has become incredibly, you know, it's really notable to me that you know, Rishi Sunak out yesterday not wearing a mask. British government ministers incredibly reluctant to wear masks. Nicola Sturgeon's been wearing a mask, right? And it's a leading by example thing. And I just think there's a certain feeling about the fact that it's like not very macho to wear a mask. It's like a bit humbling. It's a bit weedy. And therefore there's a refusal to do it. And it seems not coincidental that Boris Johnson got COVID-19. Bolsonaro now has been tested positive for it as well. And you get this situation where, you know, it's sort of seen as unmanly to protect yourself. There's an established problem with young men not wanting to wear masks and take protective equipment. So that's the kind of problem I have with not men, but one particular form of masculinity that has been shown up really badly by this crisis.
Got another question here from Jackie Carter. Helen, you talked about getting more bold as you get older. My observations of young women, I teach politics and sociology, is that they are already at that stage and questioning power structures. Do you think there is a generational difference here? And if so, how can feminism capitalize on more difficult young women?
That's really wonderful to hear from my perspective. And I think that probably is true in the sense that I think there's often a kind of lack of understanding from younger women about what their mother's generation, their grandmother's generation went through, and how that affected, you know, their kind of stance. You know, I think it's very different feeling to be one woman in an office of 50 men than it is for most, you know, most female graduates now. You know, women make up a majority of, you know, medical school undergraduates, for example. And I think some of the second wavers that I talked to had what I thought was kind of rhino thick hides. And they kind of had to develop that and a kind of, you know, you don't complain, you know, that kind of attitude, because that was what was necessary to survive in the offices of the 1970s, where you were getting your bum pinched and no one cared. And I think it was very tempting to develop a kind of shove it off, you know, there's no use complaining about this sort of stuff attitude. And I think today's 19-year-olds would think that was crazy. You know, no, of course no one would ever have to put up with that. And that's kind of wonderful. Like we just made that level of progress, that there are a whole generation for whom the norm is completely different. And I hope it really does translate into political action. But that's the bit that I'm not so sure about, is I think that I would say today's younger feminists are hyper aware of lots more injustice, perhaps because they're so much more connected to each other. What I'm not sure they feel that they've got is the tools to fight that injustice. And that's something that, you know, is about getting a political education. It doesn't, no one's born knowing how to do effective campaigning and lobbying. That's something that they will acquire with time, I hope.
Got another question from Melissa Sergi. I found the recent Karen meme, a middle-aged woman asking to speak to the manager, a really interesting manifestation of the difficult woman phenomena. A lot of my friends who consider themselves feminists are throwing it around, but it makes me a bit uncomfortable as it's recently been levied at any usually middle-aged woman who is assertive. To what extent do you think these stereotypes are so ingrained in society that they're flying under the radar of even the more progressive and gender equal-minded of us?
Oh, I think that's definitely true. Sometimes that, I mean, there is a particular type of sexism that gets camouflaged as I'm only rebuking the bad women. No, I'm against women. Just these particular group of women for some reason make me incredibly furious. And the Karen stuff is interesting because there was a legitimate use for it at the start, right? It was used by Black American women to describe a particular type of kind of white fragility and sort of, you know, white women who were trying to kind of invoke feelings of chivalry in other people. And I thought that was like a legitimate critique of a particular style of behavior. But then you see someone like Paul Joseph Watson, who, you know, writes for InfoWars, who's a member of the alt-right, going, look at this Karen, look at this Karen, look at this Karen. And you think, I don't think this man is doing good racial justice work. I think this man is using you know, getting a free hit on any middle-aged woman that he doesn't like. Mm. And you have to be really careful with, you know, we have this long history of words that are associated with women getting reappropriated and turned into insults, you know, whether it's slut or harpy or nag or witch or whatever it is. Anything that gets associated with women like that becomes a really difficult weapon. And you don't, you know, with language, none of us individually control it. And that's the thing I think has been really sad, is that, you know, something that was a useful, legitimate critique of a particular specific racialized phenomenon has been picked up very gleefully by people who share none of the goals of that and just used to say, basically, shut up women. Like, shut up women. And I think the fact that it's particularly targeted at middle-aged women in that form is really notable, right? Because there's nothing in the original version of it that says that particularly has an age component. And the new version of it really does. And it becomes that classic anti-feminist trope of, I no longer fancy you, so why are you even alive? What's the point of you? Like, go away, old hag. And that's why I'd just be really careful. I think, you know, if you're a Black American woman using it in its original context, fine, go wild. If you're a white British man using it, I think you should have a big think about what you're really saying.
Yeah. And it reminds me very much of the trope of the angry Black woman, because that gets thrown around a lot if you're assertive and you're saying, well, there's a problem here. And it's something that I'm always mindful of because it's brushed away that you're just an angry Black woman.
I think there's really disturbing research as well, actually, that women's pain is taken less seriously, and Black women's pain, particularly self-reported when you go into A&E, for example, is taken really not seriously at all because of exactly that kind of, you're strong, you've got nothing white, you don't make a fuss, and I think that when we look at those stereotypes, it's really important to unpack the problems that they bring to real people in the real world. They're not just happening in the level of language. They have real world effects on people. And as you're right, saying someone's just an angry Black woman is a very convenient way to say she's being hysterical. There's nothing legitimate to her critique. Well, argue with the argument, not with the person.
We have a question here from Ayla Holland. Is there a correlation between having boundaries and having a personality?
Well, that sounds like a deeply philosophical question. I'm not sure. But I mean, boundaries is another way of expressing the thing that I keep coming back to, right? Which is just having your own limits and being able to say no. There's an epigram. One of the chapter epigrams is, if feminism was reduced to a word, it would be this: no. And I think that's a really important thing to say, whether or not it's someone trying to heap work on you because they see you as the office drudge, or whether or not it's your ability to have control over your fertility or control over your sexual life. No is a really important word. And yeah, having boundaries is absolutely a part of the kind of personal feminist project.
Sadly, that's all we have time for. I could go on and on and on because it's just fascinating, and it's great to get together with like-minded women. But anyway, I'm going to hand back to Sarah, and I just wanted to thank you, Helen, for your time. And hopefully we can all give Helen a round of applause. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Marilyn. That was great.
Thank you both so very, very much. Thank you, Helen Lewis and Dr. Marilyn Comrie, for the final in our Radical Thinking for Radical Times talk for Series 1. Good news, people. There's a second series coming in the autumn. We're super excited about the partnerships we've got around it. Can't tell you anything yet, but if you'd like to sign up, there is a link in the chat. And we'll send it round to you. Just sign up on MailChimp, but hopefully you'll be on the socials and you'll see it coming, but we'd love to let you know. We really want to thank, as well as Marilyn and Helen, the Alliance Manchester Business School, particularly Abby, who's done all the tech and production. And again, a shout out to my awesome co-volunteers, to Claire Marie, to Becky, and to Amelia, and all the development team. If you can give £5 to the Pankhurst, that would just be terrific. A lot of women are working on saying no, and they need that support. We need to get them that PPE. Really grateful for any cash that anyone can give.